Have you ever been in a situation like this? You have tons of footage, maybe even hours of footage. Your timeline's in utter disarray and you have no clear story. Where do you even start? Well, I've been in this situation many times, so today I'd like to invite you into my edit suite so I can share 4 big lessons I've learned over my 20-year career that will help you immensely with any of your documentary or interview editing with concepts that you can start applying today. And at the end, I'm going to share why I strongly disagree with one of the most popular pieces of advice out there on documentary editing. So stick around. Let's dive in. So picture this. I was a 19-year-old kid in film school and I had just secured one of my first paid editing gigs for way less than minimum wage at the time, I'm sure, and it was for a feature-length documentary. So I sat down and in front of me on actual tape was the footage. It wasn't 10 hours of footage, it wasn't 50 hours of footage, it wasn't 100, it wasn't 150 or even 200 hours of footage, it was over 300 hours of footage. Talk about overwhelming. Lesson 1. What's the best way to waste days, weeks, months, even years of your life? Dive into a documentary editing project without a plan. Enough time has passed on this project where I think I can say that the filmmakers, and it was their first time feature, they overshot and underplanned. You might have a project that's going on that's sort of like this. You get a big pile of footage, but without any real clarity of a concept or structure. So you're kind of stuck with it. Well, what can you do? Well, as editors, you can make your own plan. And what this might look like is not quite a script or a screenplay, which would be too rigid for a documentary piece, but more like a story structure. The biggest benefit of having a story structure is that you can largely set aside content or storylines that don't fit within that structure, so you can start to narrow your focus. And with a feature-length documentary, you probably have a similar dramatic structure that you would have in a narrative film. You might start with the ordinary world of the protagonist, then an inciting incident kind of kicks off the story. You have a plot point that sends you into Act 2, a midpoint where things change, and at the end of Act 2, you'd have something called the big gloom, which is the lowest point for the protagonist, usually the saddest scene, the most hopeless scene of the film. That would take you into Act 3 with more rising action to get to a climax, and then finally a resolution. Now, if you're cutting something shorter, and I'll show you an example from a doc I cut that was only 2 minutes long, I think a simple way to look at it is cut up the story into 25% chunks and make sure things are changing at each of those major plot points. By the way, if you're enjoying this type of content, you might really like my free editing guide, which you can download at the link in the description. Once you've outlined your story structure, then you can dive into the audio. Notice I said audio and not visuals. In documentary or interview-based filmmaking, the audio is the story. In a scripted narrative, you're really trying to build a visual story. In documentary, you're trying to find the story, and that comes from what people say. So I would even go as far to say that I like to create an entire cut of the movie where I'm really focused on audio. Yes, of course, my visuals are synced up, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if things are flowing and working from an audio standpoint, odds are you're onto something in terms of your story and your content. Now, I want to illustrate the power of having a structure when you're working on a doc or interview-based edit by showing you my timeline for a doc I cut fairly recently. And the subject of the doc is an environmentally friendly office tower going up in Austen, Texas. And the doc is only a little over 2 minutes. And if you look at my timeline, I actually color-coded the different sections of the doc as I saw them as I was crafting it. And look how close this is to it being 25% chunks like I outlined. I have this intro section setting up the world. Then I have 25% where they talk about the building kind of in a broad sense. Then this section here, the music shifts and we get more into the details of the building. And then finally, we have a climax resolution at the end of the piece. Having a structure in mind for this piece made the editing process so efficient and so fun to work on. And even more important than that, it made the final video so much more compelling because things changed every 25%, roughly. And remember, audiences expect that when they're watching films and videos. It's ingrained in us. So that's why story structure can be so powerful. So you know to start with structure with your documentary and interview-based edits. You know to craft that structure by diving into the audio, not necessarily the visuals, which we'll get to in a minute. But now I want to dive even further into audio for our next lesson. So one thing I notice a lot with beginner editors, myself included when I started, is you kind of take the audio at face value. You try to find the best lines, you put them in a good order, and you sort of stop there. Now, as an experienced pro, I can tell you, you would probably be shocked at how much dialogue is manipulated in narrative, in commercials, but especially documentary. Now, we're not trying to tell lies or make it so manipulated that it's just not true or authentic, but what we're trying to do is make the most impactful story possible. What this looks like in my editing is I'm carefully listening to all the audio, because a lot of times I end up taking a clip from over here and a clip from over here, and when you put it together, it creates that emotional impact you're looking for. And then another step I take is to exclude or cut out all the verbal distractors like the ums, the ahs, the likes, to make it sound more articulate. Like if you've ever watched a documentary where you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, these people sound so smart, that could be the editor's magic at work. And then another thing, which you might not think of, is I'm adjusting the lengths of pauses, either between words or sentences or paragraphs, to have them carry more impact or flow more naturally. Let's take a closer look at the timeline for the same doc I worked on. And I want you to pay particular attention to the waveforms. When you see a waveform clip like this, where it looks like nothing's happening, that's what's called room tone. And room tone is so helpful when you want to edit or manipulate the dialogue, because you can create your own pauses, but the sound of the room is still there, so it sounds natural. If everything dropped out, you'd be able to hear the edits. So this allowed me to adjust the cadence of all the dialogue. So not only am I cutting out takes and using clips from different takes, but I am in charge of the cadence of the speaking. And you can just see how many edits there are in this dialogue track. As you become more and more experienced, you realize the power in refining each and every frame. Now, before we move on, I want to point out an important caveat. I remember on one project, not this one, I was manipulating the dialogue. I was cutting out all the uhs and the ums, and I was really making it tight, really making the speaker seem as articulate as possible. And when I got to the end of the edit, I watched it, and it just seemed so sterile. I had actually lost the emotion I was going for. And what's funny is I actually went back and I cut back in some of those uhs and ums, some of those imperfections, and I let things breathe a little more, and the emotion came back. So while these are some of the tricks of the trade to manipulate and make things as streamlined as possible, always be cutting for that emotional target and try to notice if you're missing the mark. Now, there's a big danger to being so audio forward at the beginning of your edit, and it's this: unmotivated or unnecessary B-roll. So the lesson here is you've built out your story really thinking of audio, but once that's built out, I really want you to shift gears and give the visuals as much attention as you did the audio. I really want you to find images that add to the story and treat them with care. Don't treat them as just little pieces of footage covering up cuts. Treat them as a way to elevate the storytelling. Let's take a look at the first minute of the doc so you can see some of the structure and some of the B-roll choices that I made.
The experience of being in the perennial is really about peace. It's about a place where you can find balance.
Biophilic design refers to the methodology that allows us to incorporate nature's qualities and attributes into the things that we design.
On every floor, you could be easily connected to an outdoor space. So when you are here, you can do your best work. And that's sort of contrast and balance we feel like is really exciting and unique to the project.
Being outside in nature is one of the times I feel the most relaxed, most comfortable. And so if you can bring that to the inside, you really start to have something special.
This next lesson is going to really level up your edits. I think one common misconception with documentaries or interview pieces is that they are real life, so they don't need or require or would even benefit from any extra sound design. And that's just not the case. In this documentary I've been showing you, the Perennial documentary, I was able to use sound design not only to elevate the images in the B-roll, but to almost create a sound brand. Remember, it's about an environmentally friendly office tower, and I was able to use strategically placed bird chirping and wind sounds and nature ambiances to give you that feeling of being environmentally friendly. So not only did the sounds elevate the story, but it elevated the whole idea of the project. And that's all through sound design. So I challenge you on your next project, whether it's a sit-down interview or perhaps a slice of life documentary, take a sound design pass where you're thinking a little bit outside the box in how you can elevate the story. I have one last lesson that I think will really take your doc and interview projects to the next level, and it actually flies right in the face of most of the popular documentary editing advice out there right now. And let me illustrate it with a story. I was working on a project that was basically a 2.5-hour interview, like back-to-back talking, and I had to cut that down. I think the finished video ended up being 10 minutes. So I thought to myself, I'm going to start by making a transcript and reading through it carefully and marking up all the best lines I thought there were. So I did this. I maybe spent half a day on it, and then I bring it into my editing software and I start finding the time code and start finding all those clips I had marked. And as I started that process, I would look and listen to that clip and think to myself, now why did I mark that? That's no good. I'd get to another one, be like, well, that's okay, but it's not as good as I remember reading it. And this kept happening and happening over and over. And maybe half of the clips I had marked didn't really live up to how they seemed on paper. So I scrapped the transcript and went back to my old process of just watching the footage carefully. And what's crazy is I ended up finding so many more great quotes that didn't even jump out to me in transcript form. And I think it comes back to this quote. It's 10% what you say and 90% how you say it. And I think that's so true for filmmaking. A transcript would be a wonderful way to put a book together, right? The written word. But we're making a film, not a book. So the audio and visual performance are key. And by relying too much on a transcript and not watching your footage, you're really missing out on the material that could take your edit to the next level. So my advice, which is contrary to a lot of the documentary editing advice out there, is stop using transcripts for your short documentary and interview projects. Now, I totally understand for longer projects, there's really no way around it to use a transcript at some level. But I would challenge you to watch as much of the footage as you possibly can, and don't rely on those transcripts as a crutch. One way to use a transcript that I think is helpful is maybe read it, skim through it, get a slight overview of everything that's said to sort of fill in that initial story structure we talked about at the first lesson in this video, and then maybe have it as a search tool. So if you're literally trying to find something within lots and lots of footage, you have the transcript so you can kind of do a text-based search to quickly move between clips. But at the end of the day, I don't want you to use a transcript as an excuse to not get familiar with your footage. Because one of the best traits of an editor is someone who really becomes intimate with their footage, because you never know what you're going to need to make an impactful story. If you got value out of this video, please subscribe, and you might want to check out my free editing guide, which you can download at the link in the description. And if you liked this video, you should watch this one next. Happy editing.